Have you ever met someone who made you believe your entire future was about to change? They talked about the vacations you would take together, the house you would buy, the family you would build, the business you would start. They described a life so vivid that it felt almost real, and for a while, you believed every single word. But then something strange happened. Months passed, sometimes years. The promises stayed exactly where they started, in conversations, never in reality. If that sounds familiar, you may have experienced one of the most manipulative psychological tactics used by narcissists. It's called future faking. And once you understand how it works, you'll never hear empty promises the same way again. Future faking is not just lying. Everyone makes promises they can't always keep. Life changes, circumstances change, good intentions sometimes fail, but narcissistic future faking is completely different. It isn't about hope. It isn't about optimism. It's about control. The promise itself is never the goal. The goal is your emotional investment. Every exciting plan they describe becomes another hook, pulling you deeper into the relationship. The future becomes bait, and every time you reach for it, they move it just a little farther away. Think about why this tactic works so well. Human beings naturally make decisions based on expectations. We work hard today because we believe tomorrow will be better. We save money because we imagine a future reward. We stay in relationships because we believe they can grow into something meaningful. Hope is one of the strongest emotional forces in the human brain. Narcissists understand this instinctively. They know that if they can control your vision of tomorrow, they can often control your behavior today. At first, everything feels almost magical. They move incredibly fast. They say they've never met anyone like you. They claim you're their soulmate. They talk about introducing you to their family, moving in together, getting married, traveling the world, or building an incredible future. They speak with absolute certainty, no hesitation, no doubt. Their confidence makes the fantasy feel believable. You don't feel manipulated, you feel chosen. Then something subtle begins to happen. Every time reality starts exposing problems in the relationship, another exciting promise appears. You question their behavior. Suddenly they're talking about your dream vacation. You feel neglected. They start discussing buying a house together. You consider leaving. They mention engagement rings. Notice the pattern? The promise almost always appears when you're emotionally pulling away. That's not a coincidence. Future faking is emotional damage control. Instead of fixing today's problems, they distract you with tomorrow's fantasy. They replace accountability with anticipation. Instead of asking whether they're treating you well today, you become focused on what life will supposedly become later. This creates one of the most dangerous psychological traps imaginable. You stop evaluating the relationship based on reality. Instead, you evaluate it based on potential. You begin dating the person they keep describing instead of the person standing right in front of you. That's exactly where they want you. One of the biggest reasons intelligent people fall for future faking has nothing to do with intelligence at all. It has everything to do with emotional consistency. Once you've invested time, energy, love, and hope into someone, your brain naturally wants those investments to pay off. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the sunk cost effect. The more you've already invested, the harder it becomes to walk away. Narcissists exploit this tendency masterfully. Every new promise becomes another reason to stay just a little longer. Maybe next month they'll finally change. Maybe after the holidays. Maybe once work slows down. Maybe after the wedding. Maybe after the move. Maybe after the baby. Notice how later becomes permanent. The future never actually arrives because the promise was never designed to become reality. Another reason future faking feels so convincing is because narcissists often sound incredibly sincere. Many people assume manipulation always looks cold and calculated. In reality, some narcissists become emotionally invested in their own fantasies while they're speaking. For that moment, they may even believe themselves. Their excitement feels genuine because it is genuine, for a few minutes. But genuine emotion doesn't automatically create genuine commitment. Character remains. This distinction changes everything. Healthy people make promises carefully, because they understand promises create responsibility. Narcissists often make promises freely, because they enjoy the emotional reaction those promises create. They love watching your eyes light up. They enjoy seeing your defenses disappear. They crave the admiration, gratitude, and emotional dependency that follow. The promise itself becomes a performance. Eventually you begin noticing inconsistencies. The vacation never gets booked. The apartment search keeps getting postponed. The conversations about marriage become strangely vague. Every practical step encounters another excuse. Something always comes up. Someone else becomes responsible. Timing is never quite right. There's always another obstacle standing between today and the future they described. Yet somehow every conversation ends with another exciting vision. Another plan, another dream, another promise. And somehow you find yourself believing again. That's because future faking doesn't depend on logic. It depends on emotion. The emotional high created by hope temporarily overrides the evidence sitting directly in front of you. Your brain becomes addicted to possibility instead of reality. Each promise releases a burst of optimism that temporarily eases disappointment. It's almost like emotional pain medication. The relief feels real, even though the underlying problem remains completely untreated. Over time, this creates emotional confusion. You begin questioning your own judgment. Friends express concern, but you defend the narcissist. Family members point out broken promises, but you explain them away. Deep inside, you don't want to admit you've been manipulated, because accepting that truth means grieving the future you believed was coming. And that's one of the hardest losses anyone can experience. Sometimes the most painful relationship isn't the one you actually had. It's the one you thought you were going to have. One of the clearest signs of future faking is the endless cycle of emotional resets. Every time disappointment reaches its breaking point, the narcissist suddenly becomes the person you always hoped they could be. They apologize. They sound reflective. They talk about lessons they've learned. They promise that everything is about to change. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, their behavior improves just enough to restore your hope. Then, almost without warning, everything slips back to exactly where it was before. The promises fade. The effort disappears. The excuses return. What you're witnessing isn't real transformation. It's reinforcement. The narcissist isn't trying to build a healthy relationship. They're trying to keep you emotionally invested just long enough to prevent you from leaving. This pattern works because the human brain is wired to chase unpredictable rewards. Think about a slot machine in a casino. If it never paid out, nobody would keep playing. But because it occasionally delivers a reward, people keep pulling the lever. Relationships built on future faking often operate the same way. Most of the time you're disappointed, but every once in a while you receive affection, attention, or another beautiful promise. Those rare emotional highs become incredibly addictive. You start chasing them, believing that if you just hold on a little longer, the relationship you've been promised will finally become real. Another dangerous part of future faking is how it slowly changes your standards. At the beginning of the relationship, you probably expected honesty, consistency, respect, and follow-through. Those seemed like basic requirements. But after months of broken promises, your expectations begin to shrink. Suddenly you're celebrating tiny improvements that wouldn't have impressed you before. A single thoughtful message feels extraordinary. One weekend without conflict feels like proof they're changing. A conversation about the future feels like progress, even if nothing actually happens afterward. Without realizing it, you've stopped expecting healthy behavior. You're simply hoping for less disappointment. That's how manipulation rewrites your reality. The narcissist doesn't have to become better. They only need you to expect less. One of the most heartbreaking moments comes when victims realize they've been waiting for a version of someone who never truly existed. The charming, attentive, future-focused person from the beginning wasn't necessarily fake in every sense, but it wasn't sustainable because it wasn't rooted in genuine character. It was rooted in gaining your trust, your admiration, and your emotional commitment. Once those needs were satisfied, maintaining the illusion became unnecessary. The promises remained because promises are cheap. Consistent action requires empathy, accountability, and sacrifice. Those qualities are far more difficult for a narcissist to sustain. Pay close attention to one simple question. When they make a promise, do they immediately begin taking measurable steps toward making it happen? Or do they simply enjoy talking about it? Healthy people move toward their goals. Manipulative people often move toward conversations about their goals. Those are very different things. Real commitment leaves evidence. It creates calendars, appointments, applications, savings plans, discussions with family, practical decisions, and visible progress. Future faking leaves excitement, nothing more. You may also notice that narcissists become surprisingly defensive when you ask about their promises. A simple question like, "When are we actually going to do this?" suddenly turns into an argument. They accuse you of being impatient, they claim you don't trust them, they insist you're putting too much pressure on the relationship. Somehow the focus shifts away from their broken promise and lands on your reaction instead. This psychological maneuver is incredibly effective because it makes you feel guilty for expecting consistency. Instead of questioning their behavior, you begin questioning your own expectations. That is exactly how accountability disappears. If every broken promise becomes your fault for asking about it, the narcissist never has to confront reality. Eventually, many victims stop asking altogether. Silence becomes easier than disappointment, hope becomes easier than conflict, and waiting becomes a lifestyle. But here's the truth that changes everything. Love should never require you to constantly ignore reality. Healthy relationships aren't built on endless promises, they're built on repeated actions. Anyone can describe a beautiful future. Character is revealed by what happens between conversations. This is why paying attention to patterns is far more important than paying attention to words. Words create emotion, patterns reveal truth. If someone has broken the same promise 5 times, the 6th promise deserves more observation than excitement. Trust should never be based on potential alone. It should be based on demonstrated consistency over time. This realization can feel painful because it forces you to separate fantasy from evidence. The future you've imagined may have been incredibly beautiful. Maybe you pictured growing old together. Maybe you imagined building a family, sharing milestones, supporting one another through life's biggest moments. Letting go of those dreams feels like losing something real. But there's an important distinction. You're not grieving the relationship you actually had. You're grieving the relationship you were repeatedly promised. Those are not the same thing. Once you understand that difference, something powerful begins to happen. Your focus slowly shifts away from listening to promises and toward observing behavior. Instead of asking, "What do they say they want?" you begin asking, "What are they consistently doing?" That single question has protected countless people from years of emotional manipulation. Because actions are difficult to fake forever. Words are effortless. And narcissists know it. The moment you stop being hypnotized by tomorrow is often the moment their influence starts fading. Suddenly their speeches lose their magic. Their dramatic declarations sound familiar instead of exciting. Their promises begin resembling reruns instead of possibilities. You recognize the script because you've heard it before. Different details, same ending. Nothing changes, except the date on the calendar. And once you see that pattern clearly, it becomes much harder to ignore it again.